Chapter 15. Mr. Collins wasn't a particularly sensible man, and his lack of natural intelligence hadn't been improved much by his education or social interactions. He had spent most of his life under the guidance of an uneducated and stingy father. Despite having attended one of the universities, he had made no valuable connections there. He had merely completed the necessary requirements without forming any useful acquaintances. The strict upbringing by his father had initially instilled great humility in him. However, this humility had been eroded over time by his own self-importance due to early and unexpected success. A fortunate opportunity had brought him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention when the position of rector at Hunsford became vacant. His deep respect for her high status, combined with his own sense of importance as a clergyman and rector, resulted in a mixture of pride and servility, self-importance and humility. Now, with a comfortable home and a sufficient income, Mr. Collins had marriage on his mind. In seeking reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had his sights set on marrying one of the daughters, provided they were as beautiful and amiable as common reports suggested. This was his way of making amends for inheriting their father's estate, a plan he considered excellent, generous, and selfless. Upon seeing the Bennet sisters, Mr. Collins remained resolute in his choice. Miss Bennet's lovely appearance confirmed his intentions, and she became his favored candidate. However, the next morning brought an alteration to his plans. In a private conversation with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast, during which they discussed his parsonage house and his hope of finding a suitable mistress for it at Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet hinted that Jane, the eldest daughter, might soon be engaged. This prompted Mr. Collins to change his preference from Jane to Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet, delighted by the prospect of her daughters getting married, treasured this hint and began to favor Mr. Collins. Lydia, planning to walk to Meryton, convinced her sisters to accompany her, and Mr. Collins joined them at Mr. Bennet's request. Mr. Bennet was eager to get rid of him so that he could have his library to himself. In the library, Mr. Collins engaged Mr. Bennet in conversation about his house and garden at Hunsford, much to Mr. Bennet's annoyance. The group walked to Meryton, and Mr. Collins's pompous remarks and the polite responses from the Bennet sisters filled the time. In Meryton, the younger Bennet sisters were more interested in catching the attention of the officers than in Mr. Collins's company. Their eyes were fixed on the street in search of the officers, and only fashionable bonnets or new fabrics in shop windows could divert their attention. However, the arrival of a young man and an officer on the other side of the street quickly captivated the attention of the ladies. The officer was Mr. Denny, the man Lydia had asked about, and he was accompanied by a stranger. The stranger was Mr. Wickham, who had returned from London with Mr. Denny and had accepted a commission in their regiment. Mr. Wickham's charming appearance, combined with his new military role, made him highly appealing. As they greeted the ladies, Mr. Bingley explained that he had come to Longbourn to inquire about Jane. Mr. Darcy corroborated this with a bow. However, the meeting took an unexpected turn when Mr. Wickham greeted Mr. Darcy and touched his hat. Mr. Darcy acknowledged him with a nod, leaving everyone surprised and curious about the meaning of their interaction. Bingley and Darcy took their leave and rode on, leaving Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham with the Bennet sisters. Mr. Denny introduced Mr. Wickham, and the group walked to the door of Mr. Phillips's house. Inside, Mrs. Phillips expressed her surprise at the sudden return of the two eldest Bennet sisters and welcomed Mr. Collins, who had been introduced by Jane. Mrs. Phillips was impressed by Mr. Collins's politeness, although it seemed excessive to her. She contemplated the stranger Mr. Wickham, who had captured the ladies' attention earlier. The prospect of a lively evening of lottery tickets and a hot supper was appealing to the Bennet sisters, and they left in high spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies as he left the room, although they were unnecessary. On their way home, Elizabeth recounted the interaction between the two gentlemen to Jane. Jane would have defended them if they had appeared wrong, but their behavior was puzzling to both sisters. Mr. Collins returned to Longbourn and pleased Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He claimed that, aside from Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never encountered a more elegant woman. He was surprised and flattered by the attention he had received, especially the unexpected invitation for the following evening. This newfound respect seemed to be attributed to his connection with the Bennet family, and he had never experienced such attention before in his life. Chapter 16. Since there was no objection to the young people spending time with their aunt, and Mr. Collins's concerns about leaving Mr. and Mrs. Bennet for a single evening were firmly dismissed, a coach carried him and his 5 cousins to Meryton at an appropriate hour. The girls were delighted to learn, upon entering the drawing-room, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation and was currently in the house. With this news settled, and everyone taking their seats, Mr. Collins finally had the opportunity to observe his surroundings. He was greatly impressed by the size and furnishings of the room. In fact, he remarked that he could almost have mistaken it for the small summer breakfast parlor at Rosings. At first, this comparison didn't bring much satisfaction. However, once Mrs. Phillips inquired about Rosings and its owner, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and Mr. Collins described one of her drawing rooms, particularly mentioning an £800 chimney-piece, Mrs. Phillips was deeply flattered. She even likened the drawing-room to the housekeeper's room, considering it a great compliment. Mr. Collins continued to discuss Lady Catherine's grandeur and his own humble abode, all while Mrs. Phillips listened attentively. Her perception of his importance grew with every word, and she decided to share this information with her neighbors as soon as possible. For the girls, who couldn't participate in Mr. Collins's conversation and were left waiting for musical instruments, the time seemed to drag on endlessly. Finally, the waiting was over. The gentleman arrived, and when Mr. Wickham entered the room, Elizabeth realized she had neither seen him nor thought of him with undue admiration since their earlier encounter. The officers from the Shire were generally respectable and gentlemanly, with Mr. Wickham being the most outstanding among them in terms of appearance, countenance, demeanor, and stride. They were undoubtedly superior to the portly and plain Uncle Phillips who followed them into the room. Mr. Wickham became the center of attention for almost every lady, with Elizabeth being the fortunate one by his side. His pleasant conversation, even though it initially revolved around the dreary topic of a rainy night and the possibility of a wet season, made even the most mundane subjects interesting thanks to his conversational skill. With Mr. Wickham and the officers as rivals for the ladies' attention, Mr. Collins appeared to fade into insignificance. To the young ladies, he was hardly worth noting. However, Mrs. Phillips remained a kind listener and ensured he had an ample supply of coffee and muffins. When card tables were set up, Mr. Collins had the opportunity to return the favor by joining Mrs. Phillips in a game of whist. "I'm not very familiar with the game at the moment," he admitted, "but I'm eager to improve myself, given my circumstances." Mrs. Phillips appreciated his willingness but didn't require an explanation. Mr. Wickham, on the other hand, did not participate in the card game. Instead, he happily took a seat between Elizabeth and Lydia, who initially monopolized his attention with her incessant chatter. However, Lydia soon became engrossed in a lottery game, leaving Mr. Wickham free to engage in a conversation with Elizabeth. She was eager to listen, although what she most wanted to hear couldn't be mentioned: the story of Mr. Wickham's acquaintance with Mr. Darcy. Mentioning Mr. Darcy was out of the question, but Mr. Wickham unexpectedly initiated the subject. He asked about the distance between Netherfield and Meryton, and then, in a hesitant manner, inquired how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. "About a month," Elizabeth replied. "And I understand he has a substantial estate in Derbyshire?" "Yes," replied Wickham. "His estate there is quite grand. It yields a clear £10,000 per year. You couldn't find anyone better informed about it than me, because I have had a particular connection with his family from my early days." Elizabeth was taken aback. "You surprise me. Are you well acquainted with Mr. Darcy?" "I can't really pass judgment on whether he's agreeable or not," Wickham replied. "I'm not qualified to make that call. I've known him for too long and too well to be impartial. It's impossible for me to be fair. However, your opinion of him would likely astonish many, especially if you were to express it as strongly as you have here. In your own family, you're more forthright." Elizabeth retorted, "I speak no differently here than I might in any house nearby, except Netherfield. Mr. Darcy is not well liked in Hertfordshire. His arrogance disgusts everyone. You won't hear a good word about him from anyone. I cannot pretend to be sorry for it," Wickham continued after a brief pause. "If he wishes to avoid me, he must leave. We are not on friendly terms, and it always pains me to encounter him. But I have no reason to avoid him except one that I would gladly proclaim to the world: a sense of great mistreatment and the painful regret that he is not the man he should be." Miss Bennet, his father, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the finest men who ever lived, and my truest friend. I could forgive him anything rather than his disappointment of his father's hopes and the dishonor he brings to his memory. Elizabeth found Mr. Wickham's sentiments admirable and thought him even more handsome for expressing them. "What do you think could have motivated his behavior?" she inquired after a pause. "What could lead him to be so cruel?" Mr. Wickham hesitated for a moment and then replied, "I wonder if he's likely to remain in this country for much longer." "I have no knowledge of his plans," Elizabeth answered, "but I heard nothing about his departure when I was at Netherfield. I hope his presence in the neighborhood won't affect your plans regarding the Shire." "Oh no, Mr. Darcy won't drive me away," Wickham assured her. "If he wants to avoid seeing me, he can leave. We aren't on friendly terms, and it always pains me to encounter him, but I have no reason to avoid him except for one that I could openly share with the world: a deep sense of unfair treatment and profound regret for what he has become." Miss Bennet, his father, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men who ever lived, and my truest friend. I could forgive him anything and everything rather than see him disappoint his father's hopes and dishonor his memory. Elizabeth respected his feelings and found him even more attractive for expressing them. "But why," she asked after a pause, "do you think he behaved so cruelly?" Mr. Wickham's reply was shocking. "I wonder if he's likely to stay in this country much longer." Elizabeth was taken aback. How could this happen? How could his father's will be disregarded? Why didn't you seek legal redress? The terms of the bequest were informal enough to offer me no hope of legal recourse, Wickham explained. A man of honor would never doubt the intent. However, Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it, treating it as a conditional recommendation at best, and claiming that I had forfeited any claim to it due to my extravagance, imprudence, or simply because I was himself. The living became vacant 2 years ago, precisely when I reached the age to assume it, but it was granted to another man. I cannot blame myself for losing it. I may have a warm and unguarded temperament, and perhaps I've spoken my mind about him a bit too freely at times. But I can't recall anything worse. In any case, we are very different men, and he despises me." Elizabeth exclaimed, "This is utterly shocking. He deserves public disgrace. It will come to him sooner or later, but it won't be by my doing. Until I can forget his father, I cannot openly challenge or expose him." Elizabeth admired his sentiments and thought him even more handsome for expressing them. But what, she asked after a pause, could have been his motive? What could have driven him to behave so cruelly? A deep-seated, determined aversion towards me, an aversion that I can only partly attribute to jealousy. If the late Mr. Darcy had liked me less, his son might have tolerated me better. But his father's extraordinary affection for me, I believe, irritated him from a very early age. He did not possess the temperament to endure the kind of competition in which we found ourselves, nor the sort of preference that was often shown to me. "I never thought Mr. Darcy to be so bad," Elizabeth exclaimed. "Though I've never liked him, I didn't hold such a low opinion of him. I assumed he looked down upon his fellow beings in general, but I never suspected him of stooping to such malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this." After a moment of reflection, she continued, "I do recall him boasting once at Netherfield about his unforgiving nature, about having a temper that held grudges. His disposition must be truly dreadful." "I won't pass judgment on the matter," replied Wickham. "I can hardly be fair to him." Elizabeth went back to her thoughts and then exclaimed, "To treat the godson, friend, and favorite of his father in such a manner! And you, a young man like you, whose very appearance speaks of your amiability." But she settled for saying, "and someone who, I believe you mentioned, had been his constant companion since childhood, closely connected in every way. We were born in the same parish, grew up within the same park, and spent the majority of our youth together. We lived in the same house, enjoyed the same pastimes, and received the same parental care. My father initially pursued the same profession as your uncle, Mr. Phillips, appears to excel in. But he gave up everything to be of service to the late Mr. Darcy and dedicated all his time to the management of the Pemberley estate. Mr. Darcy held him in the highest regard and considered him a close and trusted friend. Mr. Darcy often acknowledged that he owed the greatest debt of gratitude to my father for his active supervision. And just before my father's death, Mr. Darcy made a voluntary promise to provide for me. I am convinced that he considered it both a debt of gratitude to my father and an expression of his affection towards me." "How astonishing!" Elizabeth exclaimed. "How appalling! I'm surprised that Mr. Darcy's pride alone hasn't compelled him to treat you justly. If for no other reason, he should have refrained from dishonesty, for I must call it dishonesty." "It is indeed remarkable," Wickham replied. "For almost all his actions can be traced back to pride, and pride has often been his closest ally, aligning him more with virtue than any other emotion. But none of us are entirely consistent, and in his treatment of me, there were stronger motivations than pride." "Could such terrible pride as his have ever benefited him?" "Yes, it has often led him to be generous and liberal. He freely gave his money, practiced hospitality, assisted his tenants, and helped the poor. Family pride and filial pride, for he was very proud of his father's legacy, played a role. He strives to maintain the respectability of the Darcy name, to uphold its fine qualities, and to preserve the influence of Pemberley House. He also possesses a brotherly pride and, coupled with some brotherly affection, makes him a very caring and watchful guardian to his sister. You will often hear him praised as the most attentive and best of brothers." "What is Miss Darcy like?" He shook his head. "I wish I could describe her as amiable. It pains me to speak ill of any Darcy, but she is much like her brother, exceedingly proud. As a child, she was affectionate and pleasing, and she had a great fondness for me. I devoted countless hours to her entertainment. But she means nothing to me now. She's a pretty girl, around 15 or 16, and I understand she's highly accomplished. Since her father's death, she's lived in London, where a lady resides with her, overseeing her education." After numerous pauses and attempts at discussing other topics, Elizabeth couldn't help but return to her initial question. "I'm surprised at Mr. Bingley's friendship with Mr. Darcy. How can Mr. Bingley, who appears to be the epitome of good humour and, I truly believe, a genuinely amiable man, be friends with someone like Mr. Darcy? How can they possibly get along? Have you met Mr. Bingley?" "Not at all. He's a good-natured, amiable, charming man. He can't possibly know what Mr. Darcy is like." "Perhaps not, but Mr. Darcy can be agreeable when he wishes. He possesses the necessary abilities. He can be a pleasant companion when he deems it worthwhile. Among those of equal consequence, is a very different man from what he is with those of lesser fortune. His pride never abandons him, but with the wealthy, he is open-minded, fair, sincere, reasonable, honorable, and perhaps even agreeable, allowing for some influence from their status and wealth." After the whist game concluded, the players gathered around the other table, and Mr. Collins took his place between his cousin Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. Mrs. Phillips inquired about his success, to which he replied that he had not fared well, having lost every point. When Mrs. Phillips expressed her concern, Mr. Collins reassured her with utmost seriousness that the loss of money was of no consequence to him. He considered it a mere trifle and urged her not to worry. "I am well aware, madam," he said, "that when people sit down at a card table, they must be prepared for such outcomes. Fortunately, I am not in a position where 5 shillings holds any significance. There are certainly many who cannot say the same, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, I am beyond the need to concern myself with trivial matters." Mr. Wickham's attention was piqued, and after observing Mr. Collins for a moment, he quietly asked Elizabeth whether her cousin was very closely connected to the de Bourgh family. "Lady Catherine de Bourgh," Elizabeth replied, "has recently provided him with a living." I'm not entirely sure how Mr. Collins first came to her attention, but he has not known her for long. "You are aware, I presume, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters, which makes her the aunt of the present Mr. Darcy." "No, indeed, I had no knowledge of Lady Catherine's connections. I was completely unaware of her existence until just the day before yesterday. Her daughter, Mr. Bourgh, is expected to inherit a substantial fortune, and it is believed that she and her cousin will unite the two estates." This information brought a smile to Elizabeth's face as she thought of poor Miss Bingley. She realized that all of Miss Bingley's efforts and affection for Mr. Darcy's sister, as well as her praise of Mr. Darcy himself, would be in vain if he was already destined to marry another. "Mr. Collins," she said, "speaks highly of both Lady Catherine and her daughter, but based on some of the particulars he has shared about her ladyship, I suspect that his gratitude might be leading him astray. Despite her being his patroness, I believe she is an arrogant and conceited woman." "I tend to agree with you to a great extent," replied Wickham. "I haven't seen her in many years, but I distinctly remember that I never liked her, and her manners were domineering and insolent. She is reputed to be remarkably intelligent and clever, but I suspect that her abilities are partly derived from her rank and wealth, partly from her authoritative demeanor, and the rest from the pride of her nephew, who seems to prefer that everyone associated with him possesses a first-class understanding." Elizabeth acknowledged that he had given a very reasonable account of the situation, and they continued their conversation with mutual satisfaction until supper was served, putting an end to the card games and allowing Mr. Wickham to bestow his attentions on the other ladies. The noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party left little room for conversation, but Wickham's manners endeared him to everyone present. Whatever he said it well, and whatever he did it gracefully. Elizabeth left with her thoughts filled with Mr. Wickham. She couldn't stop thinking about him and what he had told her during the entire journey home. Unfortunately, there wasn't even a moment to mention his name, as Lydia and Mr. Collins never ceased their chatter. Lydia talked incessantly about lottery tickets, the fish she had won and lost, while Mr. Collins, in describing Mr. and Mrs. Phillips's hospitality, claimed not to mind his losses at whist, listed all the dishes at supper, and repeatedly worried that he was imposing on his cousins. They both had more to say than they could manage before the carriage finally arrived at Longbourn House. Chapter 17. Elizabeth shared with Jane, the next day, the conversation she had with Mr. Wickham. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. It was difficult for her to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard. Yet she couldn't bring herself to question Wickham's veracity, as he appeared so amiable. The possibility of Wickham having truly endured such unkindness stirred her tender feelings. The only course of action was to think well of both men, defend their conduct, and attribute any discrepancies to accident or misunderstanding. Jane said, "They have both, I dare say, been deceived in some way, of which we can form no idea. Perhaps interested parties have misrepresented each other. It is impossible for us to conjecture the causes or circumstances that may have caused a rift between them without any actual blame on either side. Elizabeth agreed, very true, indeed. And now, my dear Jane, what do you have to say in defense of those interested parties who may have been involved in this affair? Do you wish to clear their names as well, or will we be forced to think ill of someone? Jane laughed. Laugh as much as you like, but you won't laugh me out of my opinion. My dearest Lizzie, consider what a disgraceful light this places Mr. Darcy in, to treat his father's favourite in such a manner, someone his father had promised to provide for. It's impossible. No man with any common sense, no man who values his character, could do such a thing. Could his closest friends be so excessively deceived by him? I think not. Elizabeth added, I can more easily believe that Mr. Bingley was deceived than that Mr. Wickham would invent such a story about himself as he told me last night. Names, facts, everything mentioned without hesitation. If it's not true, let Mr. Darcy deny it. Besides, there was truth in his demeanour. Jane admitted, it is indeed difficult and distressing. One doesn't know what to think. Elizabeth replied, I beg your pardon, but I know exactly what to think. However, Jane was certain of one thing, if Mr. Bingley had been deceived, he would have much to endure when the truth came out. Their conversation was interrupted as they were summoned from the shrubbery by the arrival of some of the very people they had been discussing, Mr. Bingley and his sisters. They had come to personally invite the Bennet sisters to the long-awaited ball at Netherfield, which was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The two sisters were delighted to see their dear friend again, acting as if it had been ages since their last meeting. They repeatedly inquired about what Elizabeth had been doing since their separation. To the rest of the Bennet family, they paid little attention, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, speaking sparingly to Elizabeth, and ignoring the others. They soon left, rising from their seats quickly, surprising their brother, and hurrying away as if eager to escape from Mrs. Bennet's civilities. The prospect of the Netherfield ball thrilled every female member of the Bennet family. Mrs. Bennet considered it a compliment to her eldest daughter and felt particularly flattered to receive the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself instead of a formal card. Jane imagined a happy evening spent with her two friends and the attentions of their brother. Elizabeth looked forward to dancing with Mr. Wickham and hoped to see confirmation of everything in Mr. Darcy's demeanour. Catherine and Lydia anticipated happiness at the ball, which depended less on any single event or person. Although they both intended to dance with Mr. Wickham for a significant portion of the evening, he was not the only partner who could satisfy them. Even Mary saw no objection to attending the ball. She explained, as long as I have my mornings to myself, it is sufficient. I think it's no sacrifice to occasionally join in evening engagements. Society has its claims on all of us, and I consider intervals of recreation and amusement desirable for everyone. Elizabeth was in such high spirits that she couldn't help asking Mr. Collins whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation and, if so, whether he thought it proper to participate in the evening's festivities. She was surprised to find that he had no reservations about it and did not fear any reprimand, either from the Archbishop or Lady Catherine de Bourgh, for daring to dance. Mr. Collins said, I don't believe that a ball of this kind, hosted by a young man of good character, for respectable people, could have any harmful effect. I have no objection to dancing myself. and I hope to have the honor of dancing with all my fair cousins during the evening. I take this opportunity to request your company for the first 2 dances in particular, Miss Elizabeth, a preference that I hope my cousin Jane will understand and not attribute to any disrespect toward her." Elizabeth felt completely caught off guard. She had planned to be engaged by Mr. Wickham for those very dances, and now she was paired with Mr. Collins. Her vivacity had never been worse timed. There was no way to change the situation, so she accepted Mr. Collins's proposal as gracefully as possible. She was not pleased with his gallantry, as it hinted at something more. She now realized that she had been chosen among her sisters as a suitable match for the mistress of Hunsford Parsonage and as a partner for quadrille at Rosings when more eligible visitors were absent. The idea took root as she observed Mr. Collins's increasing civilities and heard his frequent attempts at compliments about her wit and vivacity. Although she was more surprised than gratified by the effect her charms had on him, her mother soon made it clear that the likelihood of their marriage pleased her immensely. Elizabeth, however, did not wish to engage in a dispute, as she knew that any response would lead to a serious argument. Mr. Collins might never make the offer, and until he did, there was no point in quarreling about it. If there had not been a Netherfield ball to prepare for and talk about, the younger Miss Bennet would have been in a pitiable state at this time. From the day of the invitation to the day of the ball, there was an unending succession of rain that prevented them from walking to Meryton. No aunts, no officers, no news could be sought after. Even the roses for Netherfield were procured through intermediaries. Elizabeth would have found it a test of her patience if there hadn't been a dance to look forward to on Tuesday, considering the continuous rain from Friday to Monday. Kitty and Lydia, in particular, would have been in a miserable state. Chapter 18. Until Elizabeth entered the drawing-room at Netherfield and scanned the gathered group of military officers in their red coats, she had never once doubted Mr. Wickham's presence. She was fully convinced that she would meet him there, and her recollections of him did not raise any alarms. She had dressed with extra care, brimming with optimism about winning over the last remaining part of his heart. She trusted that she could achieve this during the evening. But then, in an instant, a dreadful suspicion crept in. What if Mr. Wickham had been deliberately left out of the Bingleys' invitation to the officers, all for Mr. Darcy's satisfaction? Although that wasn't precisely true, the undeniable fact of his absence was affirmed by his friend Mr. Denny, to whom Lydia eagerly inquired. Mr. Denny added, with a knowing smile, that Wickham had been called away to town on business the previous day and hadn't returned yet. Elizabeth overheard this part of the conversation, which Lydia didn't catch. It confirmed her belief that Darcy was, in part, responsible for Wickham's absence, just as she had initially suspected. This deepened her displeasure with Darcy, and she could hardly muster polite responses to his inquiries that followed. For Elizabeth, showing any kindness or patience toward Darcy was equivalent to betraying Wickham. She was determined not to engage in any conversation with him and displayed a certain level of annoyance, which she couldn't fully hide even when speaking to Mr. Bingley, who was blindly favoring Darcy. Nevertheless, Elizabeth wasn't the type to stay in a bad mood for long. Even though her own prospects for the evening had been dashed, she quickly shifted her focus to her peculiar cousin and drew Charlotte Lucas's attention to him. But the first 2 dances were mortifying. Mr. Collins, with his awkward and solemn demeanor, was constantly apologizing instead of dancing correctly, often making the wrong moves without realizing it. Dancing with him was a source of shame and misery, and Elizabeth was ecstatic when she was finally free of him. Her next dance was with an officer, who provided some relief by talking about Wickham and confirming that he was well liked. Once those dances were over, Elizabeth returned to Charlotte Lucas and engaged in conversation with her. But then, she unexpectedly found herself being addressed by Mr. Darcy, who took her by surprise when he asked for her hand in a dance. Without realizing what she was doing, she accepted his offer. He walked away again promptly, leaving her to fret over her own lack of composure. Charlotte tried to console her, suggesting that she might find Mr. Darcy agreeable. Elizabeth responded with a fervent wish that finding Mr. Darcy agreeable wouldn't happen, as that would be the worst misfortune of all. She didn't want to find a man agreeable when she was determined to dislike him intensely. She didn't want that evil. When the dancing resumed, Charlotte, in a hushed tone, cautioned her not to act foolishly and allow her lingering affection for Wickham to make her appear unpleasant in the eyes of a man as important as Darcy. Elizabeth remained silent and took her place in the dance, astonished at the newfound dignity she felt when standing opposite Mr. Darcy. She could sense the amazement in the eyes of those around her. They danced without speaking for a while, and Elizabeth initially decided not to break the silence. But then she thought that it might be more punishing for her partner to be obliged to talk, so she made a casual comment about the dance. Darcy replied, but then lapsed into silence again. After a few minutes, she addressed him a second time, saying that it was his turn to say something. She suggested that they could discuss the size of the room or the number of couples. Darcy smiled and assured her that he would say whatever she wanted him to say. Elizabeth accepted his response for the time being, saying that it would do. She hinted that she might later observe that private balls were more enjoyable than public ones, but suggested that they could remain silent for the time being. Darcy inquired if she had a rule about talking while dancing, and she explained that it was necessary to speak a little, or it would be odd to be entirely silent for half an hour. However, she pointed out that for some people, conversation should be arranged in such a way that they have the trouble of saying as little as possible. Darcy then asked if she was consulting her own feelings in the present case or trying to please him. Elizabeth playfully replied that it was both. She believed there was a great similarity in their personalities. Both were unsocial and reserved, unwilling to speak unless they could say something that would amaze everyone in the room and become a memorable proverb. Darcy questioned the accuracy of this portrayal of his character, and Elizabeth teased that he likely thought it was a faithful depiction. Darcy didn't respond to this comment, and they fell silent again until the end of the dance. He then asked if Elizabeth and her sisters often walked to Meryton. She confirmed that they did and seized the opportunity to mention their recent encounter with Mr. Wickham. This mention had an immediate effect on Darcy. A deeper shade of haughtiness crossed his features, and although he didn't say anything, Elizabeth could feel his disapproval. Despite blaming herself for her weakness, she couldn't bring herself to continue the conversation. Eventually, Darcy spoke, remarking on Mr. Wickham's pleasant manners and his ability to make friends, but casting doubt on whether he could maintain those friendships. Elizabeth responded emphatically, suggesting that Mr. Wickham had been unfortunate to lose Darcy's friendship and that he was likely to suffer from that loss for the rest of his life. Darcy remained silent, seeming eager to change the subject. At that moment, Sir William Lucas approached them, intending to pass through the dance set to the other side of the room. Upon seeing Mr. Darcy, Sir William paused to compliment him on his dancing and his partner. Sir William expressed great satisfaction with Darcy's dancing, implying that it was extraordinary and rarely seen. He believed that Darcy belonged to the highest social circles and hinted that he hoped to see this pleasure repeated often, especially when a certain desirable event, alluding to a future engagement between Bingley and Jane, took place. This would result in an abundance of congratulations, and he appealed to Mr. Darcy to agree. However, he made sure not to interrupt their conversation further, jokingly referencing the bewitching young lady with bright eyes, Jane. Darcy hardly heard the latter part of Sir William's address, but the mention of his friend seemed to affect him deeply. He fixed a serious gaze on Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. After regaining his composure, Darcy turned to Elizabeth and acknowledged that Sir William's interruption had made him forget their previous conversation. Elizabeth humorously pointed out that they hadn't really been having a conversation at all. Sir William couldn't have interrupted two people who had so little to say. They had already attempted to discuss 2 or 3 topics without success, and Elizabeth couldn't imagine what they might talk about next. Darcy, with a smile, suggested discussing books. Elizabeth entered the drawing room at Netherfield, looking around for Mr. Wickham among the group of men in red coats gathered there. She had never doubted that he would be present, and her anticipation of meeting him was not dampened by any apprehensions that might have given her pause. She had taken extra care with her appearance, arriving in high spirits, hoping to win over whatever remained of Wickham's affections. She trusted that it would not take long to achieve this during the evening. However, her hopes were shattered in an instant when she realized that Mr. Wickham was conspicuously absent. She immediately suspected that his absence was deliberate, arranged by Mr. Darcy to please the Bingleys. Though this wasn't entirely accurate, the undeniable fact remained that Wickham was nowhere to be found. Mr. Denny, a friend of Wickham, confirmed this to Lydia and implied that Wickham might have wanted to avoid a certain gentleman present at the ball. Elizabeth overheard this exchange, and it only fueled her anger towards Mr. Darcy. She found it hard to respond civilly to his inquiries. Every bit of patience she showed towards Darcy seemed like an affront to Wickham. She was determined not to engage in any conversation with Mr. Darcy, showing her displeasure in her curt responses to Mr. Bingley, who was excessively fond of Darcy. However, Elizabeth was not one to hold on to ill feelings for long. Even though her own prospects for the evening had been ruined, her spirits soon rebounded. She poured out her grievances to Charlotte Lucas, whom she hadn't seen in a week, and quickly shifted her focus to the peculiarities of her cousin. The first 2 dances, though, were a source of distress. Mr. Collins, being awkward and overly serious, was apologetic rather than attentive. He often made mistakes on the dance floor without realizing it, causing Elizabeth considerable embarrassment. The moment she was free from his company was sheer ecstasy. In her next dance with an officer, Elizabeth found some relief as they discussed Mr. Wickham, and she learned that he was generally well liked. After those dances, she returned to Charlotte Lucas and was engaged in conversation when Mr. Darcy suddenly surprised her by requesting her hand for a dance. She accepted without thinking. As soon as he walked away, Elizabeth berated herself for her lack of presence of mind. Charlotte tried to console her, suggesting that Mr. Darcy might turn out to be agreeable. Elizabeth wished against such a fate, as she was determined to hate him and didn't want to find him agreeable. When the dancing resumed, Darcy approached her again, and Charlotte cautioned her not to let her fondness for Wickham make her appear unpleasant to a man of much higher standing like Darcy. Elizabeth didn't respond but joined the dance, bewildered by the fact that she was now standing opposite Mr. Darcy. She could see the astonishment in the faces of those around them, wondering how she had come to be partnered with him. For a while, they danced in silence. Elizabeth considered remaining quiet for the entire dance, thinking it might be more of a punishment for Darcy to engage in conversation with her. However, she eventually decided that forcing him to talk would be the greater torment. She made a casual comment about the dance, and he responded but then fell silent again. After a few minutes, she addressed him again, stating that it was his turn to say something. She mentioned that people should talk a bit during a dance to avoid complete silence, even though they should try to speak as little as possible to spare some guests from having to engage in conversation. Darcy asked if she was speaking according to a rule while dancing, and she replied that she followed some rules, noting that it would be odd to remain entirely silent for half an hour. She teased Darcy, suggesting that they both had unsocial, reserved personalities, preferring to speak only when they had something extraordinary to say that would astonish everyone and be remembered as a proverb. Darcy remarked that this didn't quite match her character and wondered if their personalities were really so similar. Elizabeth teased him further, suggesting that he likely saw her as a faithful representation of herself. Darcy didn't offer a response, and they danced in silence again. As the dance ended, Darcy inquired if she and her sisters often walked to Meryton. She confirmed that they did and mentioned that they had recently made a new acquaintance when they met Darcy there. This seemingly innocent comment elicited a swift change in Darcy's demeanor. A deeper haughtiness crossed his face, and he struggled to say anything. Elizabeth thought about continuing, but decided against it. Finally, Darcy spoke, acknowledging that Mr. Wickham had pleasant manners but questioning whether he could maintain friendships. Elizabeth asserted that Darcy had lost Mr. Wickham's friendship, emphasizing the injustice of it all. Darcy remained silent, seemingly eager to change the topic. Just then, Sir William Lucas approached them, complimenting Darcy on his dancing and his partner. He also hinted at the prospect of a certain desirable event involving Miss Eliza and Mr. Bingley. Darcy was briefly distracted by Sir William's reference to his friend and seemed to regard Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together, with a serious expression. Darcy soon refocused on his partner, claiming that Sir William's interruption had made him forget their previous conversation. Elizabeth commented that they hadn't been conversing much, unable to think of any suitable topics. Darcy then suggested discussing books with a smile. Elizabeth changed the subject to one that would bring joy to both of them and on which they would agree. She listened with delight to Jane's hopeful and modest expectations of Mr. Bingley's affection. She did her best to boost Jane's confidence in it. Just as Mr. Bingley joined them, Elizabeth excused herself and turned to Miss Lucas. She had hardly replied to Miss Lucas's inquiry about her last dance partner when Mr. Collins approached them with great excitement. "I've made a remarkable discovery," he said. "By a strange coincidence, I overheard someone mention the names of Mr. Burf and her mother, Lady Catherine. Can you believe it? Lady Catherine de Burfa's nephew is here. I'm grateful I found this out in time to pay my respects. I'm going to do that right now. I hope he forgives me for not doing it earlier. I must plead my ignorance of the connection." "You're not planning to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth asked in disbelief. "Indeed, I am. I'll apologize for not doing so sooner. I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew. I can tell him that her ladyship was in good health a week ago," Mr. Collins explained. Elizabeth tried to dissuade him from this plan, telling him that Mr. Darcy might view his uninvited approach as impertinent rather than complimentary to his aunt. She believed there was no need for any formal introduction and, if required, Mr. Darcy, being of higher status, should initiate such a connection. Mr. Collins listened, but remained determined to follow his own inclinations. He replied, "My dear Miss Elizabeth, I hold your judgment in high regard in matters within your understanding. However, please allow me to say that there's a wide gap between the established customs of the laity and those of the clergy. In my opinion, the clerical office is equal in dignity to the highest rank in the kingdom, provided one maintains proper humility. Thus, I must follow my conscience in this matter, and my conscience tells me it's my duty to introduce myself. I beg your pardon for not taking your advice, which I value highly in all other matters. But in this case, I believe my education and study have better equipped me to decide what is right than a young lady like yourself." He bowed and left her to approach Mr. Darcy. Mr. Collins prefaced his speech with a solemn bow. Although Elizabeth couldn't hear his words, she imagined the content and saw "apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Burf" on his lips. It vexed her to witness this display before such a man. Mr. Darcy, on the other hand, looked at Mr. Collins with obvious wonder. When Mr. Collins finally gave Mr. Darcy a chance to speak, Darcy responded with distant civility. Mr. Collins was not deterred and continued speaking, causing Darcy's contempt to grow with each word. At the end of Mr. Collins's second speech, Darcy made a slight bow and moved away. Mr. Collins then returned to Elizabeth. "I have no reason to be dissatisfied with my reception," Mr. Collins said. "Mr. Darcy seemed quite pleased with the attention I paid him. He answered me politely and even complimented Lady Catherine's discernment, implying she would never bestow a favor unworthily. It was a very gracious thought on his part. Overall, I am quite pleased with him." With no more personal interest to pursue, Elizabeth turned her attention mostly to her sister Jane and Mr. Bingley. She imagined Jane settled in that house, happy in a marriage of true affection, and even contemplated trying to like Bingley's sisters under such circumstances. She observed that her mother's thoughts were similarly inclined and decided not to approach her, lest she hear too much. When they sat down for supper, Mrs. Bennet talked incessantly about Jane's upcoming marriage to Mr. Bingley. She enumerated the advantages of the match with unflagging enthusiasm. She praised Mr. Bingley as a charming and wealthy young man living nearby, and she expressed delight in her younger daughters benefiting from Jane's marriage by meeting other rich men. Mrs. Bennet also considered it a great comfort to be able to rely on Jane to take care of her single daughters. Elizabeth couldn't stop her mother's rapid speech, and she blushed with embarrassment as Mr. Darcy overheard it. Her mother scolded her for being nonsensical when Elizabeth tried to silence her. Elizabeth urged her mother to speak more quietly and not offend Mr. Darcy. She emphasized that they owed him no special courtesy and should not say things he might dislike. But her efforts were in vain. Mrs. Bennet persisted, and Elizabeth could see that Mr. Darcy was indeed overhearing the conversation. Her mother brushed off her concerns and asked what advantage it would be to avoid offending Mr. Darcy. "Speak lower, madam," Elizabeth implored. "Why would you want to offend Mr. Darcy? You won't gain his favor by doing so." Despite Elizabeth's protests, her mother continued to discuss her plans openly, believing Mr. Darcy had no right to object to her words. Elizabeth was frustrated but couldn't change her mother's behavior. She watched Mr. Darcy's expression change from contempt to composed gravity. At last, Mrs. Bennet had nothing more to say, and the Longbourn party left. Mrs. Bennet cleverly arranged for them to wait for their carriage while the rest of the company departed. This gave them a chance to see how eagerly they were being wished away by some family members. Mrs. Hurst and her sister barely spoke, except to complain of their fatigue and express their desire to be alone. Mrs. Bennet's attempts at conversation were met with rebuffs, and her efforts cast a sense of weariness over the whole party. Mr. Collins, however, continued to praise Mr. Bingley and his sisters for their elegant entertainment and good manners. Darcy remained silent. Mr. Bennet enjoyed the scene immensely, while Mr. Bingley and Jane stood together, talking only to each other. Elizabeth and her sisters, along with Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, maintained their silence. Even Lydia was too tired to do more than occasionally exclaim how tired she was and yawn. When they finally left, Mrs. Bennet was very civil, expressing her hope of seeing the whole family soon at Longbourn. She particularly addressed Mr. Bingley and invited him to have a family dinner without the formality of a formal invitation. Bingley gladly accepted and promised to visit them as soon as he returned from London the next day. Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, convinced that she would see her daughter settled at Netherfield in 3 or 4 months, taking into account the necessary preparations. She also believed that one of her other daughters would marry Mr. Collins soon, though with less enthusiasm. Elizabeth was her least favourite child, and though Mr. Collins and the match were deemed suitable, they paled in comparison to Mr. Bingley and Netherfield. Chapter 19. The next day brought a new situation at Longbourn. Mr. Collins formally declared his intentions. He had decided to do it without any delay, as his leave of absence only extended until the following Saturday. He had no qualms or hesitations that would make this moment uncomfortable for himself. He went about it systematically, following what he believed were the customary procedures. After breakfast, he found Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, and one of the younger girls together. He addressed Mrs. Bennet with these words: "May I request, madam, the pleasure of a private conversation with your daughter Elizabeth sometime this morning?" Before Elizabeth could react, Mrs. Bennet quickly replied, "Oh, certainly. I am sure Lizzie will be delighted. She won't object at all. Come, Kitty, let's go upstairs." She began gathering her work and preparing to leave the room when Elizabeth spoke up. "Please, madam, don't go. I beg you to stay. Mr. Collins, you have nothing to say to me that can't be heard by others. In fact, I'm leaving right now." Mrs. Bennet insisted. "No, no, Lizzie, you must stay. You must hear Mr. Collins." Elizabeth, not wanting to oppose her mother further, sat down again. She tried to hide her feelings, which were a mix of distress and amusement, by keeping herself busy with some work. Mrs. Bennet and Kitty left the room, and Mr. Collins began his speech. "Believe me, dear Miss Elizabeth, your modesty only adds to your charm. I have your mother's permission to speak to you in this manner. You may already have guessed the purpose of my conversation. From the moment I entered this house, I singled you out as the one with whom I would share my life. But before I get carried away with my feelings on this matter, let me explain why I want to marry and why I came to Hertfordshire in search of a wife." The idea of Mr. Collins being carried away by his feelings almost made Elizabeth laugh, but she couldn't interrupt him. He continued, "I have 3 reasons for marrying. First, I believe it's the duty of every clergyman in my comfortable position to set an example by marrying within his parish. Second, I am convinced that marriage will bring me great happiness. And third, which I should have mentioned earlier, it's the specific advice of my esteemed patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She has twice given me her unsolicited opinion on this matter. She told me to marry and choose a gentlewoman, one who is practical and not raised too high, but capable of managing a modest income well. This is my mission. I want to find such a woman, bring her to Hunsford, and she will visit her. I must also mention that Lady Catherine's notice and kindness are among the many advantages I can offer. Her manners are beyond description, and your wit and vivacity, I believe, would be quite pleasing to her, especially when balanced with the respect her status demands. This sums up my general intention in favor of matrimony." Mr. Collins then went on to explain why he chose Longbourn as his hunting ground for a wife, despite the many eligible young women in his own neighborhood. He explained that he would inherit Longbourn after Mr. Bennet's passing, which might not happen for many years, but it was his responsibility to choose a wife from among Mr. Bennet's daughters to minimize their loss. Elizabeth decided it was time to interrupt him. "You are being hasty, sir," she cried. "You seem to forget that I haven't given you an answer yet. Let me do so now without further delay. I appreciate your compliments and your proposal, but I must decline." Mr. Collins waved his hand formally and replied, "I understand that young ladies often reject a man's advances even when they secretly plan to accept them later. Perhaps you are following that custom now. I am not discouraged, and I hope to lead you to the altar soon." Elizabeth responded with some heat, "Your hope is quite unusual after my clear rejection. I assure you, I'm not one of those young ladies, if they exist, who reject a man only to hope he will ask again. I am sincerely declining your offer. You would not make me happy, and I am sure I would not make you happy. If Lady Catherine knew me, I believe she would find me unsuitable for the position." Mr. Collins, maintaining his formality, replied, "While I do not believe Lady Catherine would disapprove of you, I respect your decision. When I have the opportunity to speak to her again, I will speak highly of your modesty, frugality, and other fine qualities. Elizabeth concluded, "There is no need for such praise, Mr. Collins. I must insist that our matter is settled." She rose and prepared to leave the room, hoping that was the end of it. "You must allow me to believe, my dear cousin, that your rejection of my advances is a mere formality. I have good reasons for thinking so. First, I don't see any reason why you should not accept my hand, and the life I can provide would be quite appealing. My social position, my connection with the de Bourgh family, and my relation to your own family are all in my favor. You should also consider that, despite your many charms, there is no guarantee that another marriage proposal will come your way. Your dowry, unfortunately, is so small that it could overshadow your beauty and admirable qualities. Therefore, I can only conclude that your rejection is not sincere, but rather a tactic to increase my affection through suspense, as is often practiced by refined women." Elizabeth responded firmly, "I assure you, sir, I have no desire to engage in the kind of elegance that involves tormenting a respectable man. I would prefer the compliment of being believed to be sincere. I appreciate your proposals, but I must emphasize that accepting them is entirely impossible. My feelings on this matter are clear. Can I be any plainer? Please do not see me as an elegant woman intent on teasing you, but as a rational individual speaking truthfully from the heart." Mr. Collins, with an awkward attempt at gallantry, exclaimed, "You are always charming. I am convinced that when both your excellent parents give their express approval, my proposals will be accepted." Elizabeth chose not to respond to his persistent self-deception. She withdrew immediately and in silence, determined that if he continued to interpret her repeated rejections as encouragement, she would speak to her father. Mr. Bennet's response would be definitive, and his actions would not be mistaken for the affectation and coquetry of an elegant woman. Chapter 20. Mr. Collins didn't have much time to savor his successful proposal. Mrs. Bennet, who had been lingering in the hallway, waiting for the outcome of the conversation, wasted no time. As soon as she saw Elizabeth open the door and hurry up the stairs, she entered the breakfast room. Mrs. Bennet expressed her delight at the prospect of their closer connection, congratulating both Mr. Collins and herself warmly. Mr. Collins received and returned her congratulations with equal enthusiasm. He then proceeded to recount the details of their meeting, expressing his satisfaction with the outcome. He believed Elizabeth's refusal was merely a product of her modesty and genuine character. However, this information surprised and concerned Mrs. Bennet. She had hoped that Elizabeth's rejection was a facade to encourage Mr. Collins, but she couldn't bring herself to believe it. She was determined to convince her daughter otherwise. "But, Mr. Collins," she added, "rest assured, Lizzie will come to her senses. I will talk to her myself. She can be quite stubborn and foolish sometimes, not recognizing her own best interests, but I will make her see reason." "Forgive me for interrupting," Mr. Collins interjected, "but if she is indeed headstrong and foolish, I'm not certain if she would be a suitable wife for someone like me, who seeks happiness in marriage. If she persists in rejecting me, perhaps it's better not to force her into accepting me, especially if she has such temperamental flaws that could diminish my happiness." Mrs. Bennet was alarmed by his words. "You completely misunderstand me," she exclaimed. "Lizzie is only headstrong in matters like this. In all other aspects, she is a good-natured girl. I will go directly to Mr. Bennet and we will resolve this matter quickly." Without waiting for a reply, she rushed to find her husband and informed him of the situation. "Oh, Mr. Bennet, you're needed immediately," she called as she entered the library. "We're in turmoil. You must make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she refuses him, and if you don't act quickly, he might change his mind and reject her." Mr. Bennet looked up from his book, his calm demeanor unchanged by her news. "I don't quite understand," he said. "What are you talking about?" "About Mr. Collins and Lizzie. Lizzie refuses to marry Mr. Collins, and now Mr. Collins is saying he won't marry Lizzie." Mr. Bennet sighed. "And what am I supposed to do in this situation? It seems rather hopeless." "Speak to Lizzie yourself," Mrs. Bennet urged. "Tell her that you insist on her marrying him." "Very well. Call her down. She shall hear my opinion." Mrs. Bennet rang the bell, and Elizabeth was summoned to the library. As she entered, her father addressed her, "Come here, child. I've called you here for an important matter. I understand that Mr. Collins has proposed marriage to you. Is that true?" Elizabeth confirmed that it was. "Yes, sir." "And you've rejected his proposal?" "I have, sir." "Very well. Let's get to the point. Your mother insists that you accept his proposal. Isn't that right, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, or I'll never speak to her again," Mrs. Bennet declared. "Elizabeth, you face an unfortunate choice," Mr. Bennet continued. "From now on, you'll be estranged from one of your parents. Your mother won't speak to you again if you don't marry Mr. Collins, and I won't see you again if you do." Elizabeth couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all, but Mrs. Bennet was disappointed, believing her husband would support her. "What do you mean, Mr. Bennet, by speaking in this manner?" she protested. "You promised to insist on her marrying him." "My dear," Mr. Bennet replied, "I have two small requests. First, allow me to freely express my thoughts on this matter. Second, grant me the use of my room. I'd like to have the library to myself as soon as possible." Despite her disappointment, Mrs. Bennet didn't give up. She talked to Elizabeth repeatedly, trying both persuasion and threats. She attempted to enlist Jane's support, but Jane declined to interfere. Elizabeth responded to her mother's appeals with a mix of seriousness and playful banter, but her decision remained steadfast. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins retreated to reflect on the situation in solitude. He couldn't fathom why his cousin had rejected him, but his pride remained mostly intact. His affection for her was mostly imagined, and the fear of deserving her mother's reproach prevented him from feeling regret. While the family grappled with this dilemma, Charlotte Lucas arrived to spend the day with them. Lydia eagerly informed her of the ongoing drama. "Charlotte, you won't believe what's happened this morning," Lydia whispered. "Mr. Collins proposed to Lizzie, and she turned him down." Charlotte barely had time to respond before Kitty approached with the same news. They entered the breakfast room, where Mrs. Bennet was alone, and immediately joined in the conversation, seeking Charlotte's support in convincing Lizzie to comply with the family's wishes. "Please, Miss Lucas," Mrs. Bennet implored in a sorrowful tone, no one is on my side. I am treated so unfairly. No one understands my nerves." Charlotte refrained from responding as Jane and Elizabeth entered the room. "Ah, here she is," Mrs. Bennet continued, acting as if she doesn't care and doing whatever she pleases. "But let me tell you, Miss Lizzie, if you keep refusing marriage proposals like this, you'll never find a husband. And I don't know who will support you when your father is no longer here. I won't be able to, and I'm warning you now. I'm done with you starting today. I told you in the library that I'd never speak to you again, and I intend to keep my word. I take no pleasure in talking to disobedient children. Not that I have much pleasure in talking to anyone. People like me, who suffer from nervous complaints, aren't inclined to talk. Nobody understands my suffering. But it's always like this. Those who don't complain are never sympathized with." Her daughters listened in silence, knowing that reasoning with her would only aggravate her further. She continued talking until they were joined by Mr. Collins, who entered with more formality than usual. When he was noticed, Mrs. Bennet instructed the girls to be quiet and let her and Mr. Collins converse. Elizabeth quietly left the room, followed by Jane and Kitty, but Lydia remained to eavesdrop. Charlotte, initially engaged in polite conversation with Mr. Collins about her family, eventually walked to the window, pretending not to hear. Mrs. Bennet initiated the conversation in a melancholic tone. "Oh, Mr. Collins." "My dear madam," Mr. Collins replied, "let us not discuss this matter any further. Please understand that I bear no ill will towards your daughter. Resigning ourselves to unavoidable circumstances is the duty we all share, particularly a young man like me who has been fortunate in receiving early preferment. I assure you, I am resigned to the situation. Perhaps my resignation is even stronger because I have doubts about my own happiness had my cousin agreed to marry me. I've observed that resignation is never so perfect as when the desired blessing begins to lose its value in our eyes. Please don't consider my actions as disrespectful to your family, dear madam, as I withdraw my proposal from your daughter's lips instead of your own. We are all prone to making mistakes. My intentions throughout this affair have been noble. My goal has been to secure a kind-hearted companion for myself while considering the well-being of your entire family. If my behavior has been objectionable in accepting my dismissal from your daughter rather than from you, I humbly apologize." Chapter 21. The discussion regarding Mr. Collins's proposal had almost come to an end. Elizabeth now had to endure the uncomfortable feelings that naturally accompanied it, along with occasional peevish remarks from her mother. Mr. Collins, on the other hand, expressed his emotions not through embarrassment or sadness, nor by avoiding Elizabeth, but rather by being stiff and maintaining a resentful silence. He hardly spoke to her at all, and the attentions he had previously paid to her were now directed towards Miss Lucas for the rest of the day, offering some relief to the awkward situation. The following day brought no improvement in Mrs. Bennet's bad mood or health, and Mr. Collins remained in his state of angry pride. Elizabeth had hoped that his resentment might lead to a shorter visit, but it seemed to have no effect on his plans. He had always intended to leave on Saturday, and Saturday was when he still intended to depart. After breakfast, the girls went to Meryton to inquire if Mr. Wickham had returned and to lament his absence from the Netherfield ball. Mr. Wickham joined them in town, and they walked together to Longbourn, discussing his absence and the concern it had caused. However, Mr. Wickham admitted that his absence had been voluntary. "I realized," he explained, as the time drew near, "that it would be best not to meet Mr. Darcy. To spend so many hours together in the same room might be more than I could bear, and it might lead to unpleasant scenes." Elizabeth commended his restraint, and they discussed it further. The two exchanged compliments, and Wickham accompanied the ladies back to Longbourn. This presented an opportunity for him to be introduced to Elizabeth's parents. After their return, Miss Bennet received a letter from Netherfield. It was opened immediately, and Jane's countenance changed as she read it. Jane, however, regained her composure and tried to engage in the general conversation. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was anxious about the letter and distracted from Wickham. Once he and his companion left, Jane signaled for Elizabeth to join her upstairs. In their room, Jane took out the letter and said, "This is from Caroline Bingley. Its contents surprised me. The entire party has left Netherfield and is on their way to town. They have no intention of returning. I'll read you what she says." She read aloud the contents of the letter, which indicated that the Bingley party had decided to follow Mr. Bingley to town and would not be returning to Hertfordshire for the winter. Jane expressed her disappointment. "It's unfortunate," Elizabeth said after a brief pause, "that you won't be able to see your friends before they leave. But perhaps Miss Bingley's hopes for future happiness will come true sooner than she thinks. The delightful friendship you shared may be renewed with even greater satisfaction once Mr. Bingley returns. There's no reason to assume he won't be back in Hertfordshire. Caroline is certain that none of the party will return this winter," Jane replied. "I'll read the passage that particularly troubles me. Mr. Darcy is eager to see his sister, and I must admit, we are just as eager to meet her again. I truly believe Georgiana Darcy has no equal in terms of beauty, elegance, and accomplishments. The affection she inspires in Louisa and me is even more special because we dare to hope that she will one day be our sister. I can't recall if I've mentioned my feelings on this subject before, but I won't keep any secrets from you." Elizabeth frowned as she listened to the passage. The discussion about Mr. Collins's proposal was almost over, and Elizabeth had to endure the uncomfortable feelings that naturally came with it, along with occasional peevish comments from her mother. Mr. Collins himself expressed his feelings not through embarrassment or sadness, nor by avoiding Elizabeth, but rather by being stiff and silent. He rarely spoke to her, and the attentive behavior he had previously shown was now directed toward Miss Lucas for the rest of the day. This was a relief to everyone, especially to Elizabeth. The next day brought no improvement in Mrs. Bennet's bad mood and ill health. Mr. Collins was still filled with angry pride. Elizabeth had hoped that his annoyance might shorten his stay, but it seemed to have no effect on his plans. He had always intended to leave on Saturday, and Saturday it would remain. After breakfast, the girls walked to Meryton to inquire if Mr. Wickham had returned and to lament his absence from the Netherfield ball. They met him in town, and he accompanied them to their aunt's house, where they discussed his regret, vexation, and the concern shared by everyone. However, Wickham confessed that he had deliberately chosen to stay away. "I found," he said, as the time drew near, "that it would be best not to meet Mr. Darcy. Spending so many hours together in the same room might be more than I could bear. Unpleasant scenes might arise. Elizabeth approved of his decision, and they discussed it in detail. As they walked back to Longbourn, Wickham paid particular attention to Elizabeth. This was advantageous as it gave him the opportunity to be introduced to her father and mother. Upon their return home, Miss Bennet received a letter from Netherfield, which she opened immediately. The letter was written on elegant, hot-pressed paper and had neat, flowing handwriting. Elizabeth noticed her sister's expression change as she read it, and she saw Jane focusing intently on certain passages. Jane soon collected herself and tried to join the general conversation cheerfully, but Elizabeth was anxious about the contents of the letter, which distracted her even from Wickham. After Wickham and his companion left, Jane signaled for Elizabeth to follow her upstairs. In their room, Jane took out the letter and said, "This is from Caroline Bingley, and its contents have surprised me. The entire party has left Netherfield by now, and they are on their way to town, with no intention of returning. Let me read what she says." Jane read aloud, and the letter mentioned their immediate move to town, with plans to dine in Grosvenor Street where Mr. Hurst had a house. The letter continued with Caroline expressing a desire to maintain frequent and candid correspondence. Elizabeth listened to this with a certain distrust, and while the sudden departure surprised her, she found nothing truly lamentable in it. She believed that Mr. Bingley would still be in Netherfield, and the loss of their society would be compensated by Jane's happiness. Caroline had hoped for Mr. Bingley to marry Miss Darcy, not Jane. She followed him to town to keep him there and tried to convince Jane that he wasn't interested in her. Elizabeth disagreed with Jane's interpretation. "No, Jane," Elizabeth said, "you should believe me. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you but wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She follows him to town to keep him there and tries to persuade you that he doesn't care about you." Jane didn't fully accept this view. She believed Caroline might be deceiving herself. Elizabeth encouraged her to consider that possibility. "That's a good thought," Elizabeth continued. "You should believe that she is deceived. You've done your duty, and there's no need to worry." Jane still had concerns, though. She wondered if she should accept a man whose family and friends wanted him to marry someone else. "You must decide for yourself," Elizabeth told her. "If, after careful consideration, you find that the misery of displeasing his two sisters outweighs the happiness of being his wife, then you should decline his proposal." "But how can you say that?" Jane asked with a faint smile. "You must know that even if I were to displease them, I could not hesitate." Elizabeth responded, "I didn't think you would hesitate, and in that case, I can't feel much sympathy for your situation." Jane considered that perhaps things might change if Mr. Bingley didn't return during the winter. Elizabeth firmly rejected the idea of him not returning at all. She thought Caroline's suggestions were self-serving, but Jane's temper was optimistic, and she hoped Bingley would return to Netherfield and fulfill her heart's desires. They decided that Mrs. Bennet would be informed of the family's departure without alarming her about Mr. Bingley's conduct. This news concerned Mrs. Bennet, and she lamented the unfortunate timing of their departure. After expressing her sorrow for a while, she took comfort in the hope that Mr. Bingley would return to Longbourn soon, and she concluded that even though he had been invited for a family dinner, she would make sure there were 2 full courses.